Now, since the weather is so nice and the book that I'm going to be reviewing is Death in Spring, spring has finally come and I thought, why not do this review outside in the garden? So here I am, going to review the book for you. Now, I've just this moment finished reading it, and I think straight off the bat I'm going to give it 5 stars. I don't really know where to begin trying to describe this book. I think let's start with the cover. Now, it's a beautiful cover. It's part of the new edition by Penguins, in which they're doing a series of books from classic European writers that have kind of gone under the radar, and they're trying to bring them back to kind of foster a more closer relation with the European countries, given everything that has been happening currently in the UK. It's got the nice pattern up here, and they're going to have a different pattern for each book, but they've also got a nice picture. Now, I think it's the picture here that kind of gave me the sense of this book being something that it wasn't. Looking at the picture, it kind of evokes the sense of the very real sense of place and the real, human experience. And I won't say that this book isn't a real human experience, but I just feel like the photo gave me the sense that it was going to be very much set in a real time, a real place, and with very real feeling people. It's going to be very real, however many times I can say that. However, the book itself is almost genre defying. It's a little bit magical realism, but kind of not at the same time. However, it definitely has these elements that kind of remove you from the specific reality that we understand and kind of perceive it in a different way, which is really interesting and something that I feel probably wasn't given to you from the way this book was sold, or marketed at least. I'll also read to you the synopsis. Death in Spring is a dark and dreamlike tale of a teenage boy's coming of age in a remote village in the Catalan mountains, a place cut off from the outside world, where cruel customs are blindly followed and attempts at rebellion swiftly crushed. When his father dies, he must navigate this oppressive society alone and learn how to live in a place of crippling conformity. Often seen as an allegory for life under a dictatorship, Death in Spring is a bewitching and unsettling novel about power, exile, and the hope that comes from even the smallest gestures of independence. So again, that kind of made me feel that this book was going to be very much drenched in a history, and despite it being set in a rural town, I imagined it would be a very specific town or a village where you could get a sense for that place. In the back, when it also gives you a little bio of the author, Mercè Rodoreda, it says, during the Spanish Civil War, she was exiled to France and later Switzerland. Rodoreda was able to return to Barcelona only in the mid-1960s, where she wrote several prize-winning novels in Catalan, including Death in Spring, which was inspired by her experience of Franco's dictatorship. So going into this book, I had an awareness that this was going to be about the author's experience of living under a dictatorship and her experience of fascism during the Franco era, and specifically the pressures put onto the Catalan minority in assimilating to the Spanish rule. I had this idea of what this book was going to be about, and then I started reading it, and it was wonderful, and it was very different in a way that I was glad that it was. Like I said before, this book has this sense of fantasy. There's this kind of real fairy tale feeling to it. It's almost as if some old woman from a time almost forgotten is sharing stories from her hometown, and although the main character is a young teenage boy and it's all spoken from his perspective, you kind of feel like he's this timeless being who lives within and without time at the same time. There are elements in the book where he actually talks about this kind of feeling that he is time and he is also without time, and it gave the whole book a sense of memory. I was talking to Miriam and to Davide about this when I was reading it halfway through, and I said that I feel like on the one hand it's a very comforting book in that it feels like it's just a story being told to you from someone you are very close to, and then on the other hand there's no real surprise or there's no real twist, and the twists that are there feel like you already could see them coming. And I know that some people want that twist in the story, but the way that it's done in here just feels like you're being greeted by an old friend almost. Yet at the same time, because of this and because you don't actually know what's happening, I felt like I was being haunted by the text whilst I was reading it, which is very interesting, because oftentimes if I ever say I've been haunted by a book, it's often because I've finished the book and I'm still thinking about it. For example, 100 Years of Solitude or The Vor. This felt like I was being haunted by it whilst I was reading it, which had this very surreal feeling in itself, and I think that kind of reverts back to this whole sense of timelessness. There's a sense of displacement in that you are very specifically set in this one small village, and yet at the same time, the way that the surrounding countryside and the surrounding mountains are described, you feel like you're everywhere and nowhere at once. And when it's written about the character moving through different places, it's kind of loose and it skips and it jumps, and you kind of sometimes forget where you are, which I think could be annoying to some people, but for me, I didn't mind it at all. It was something that I quite liked. I didn't feel like I needed a sense of this place where it was being set, because it could have been anywhere or it could be nowhere. And it jumps between memory and time. So sometimes you're not quite certain whereabouts you are. And towards the end, the character talks about how he can't quite remember, and the memories are beginning to seep into each other, and time and place kind of seems a little bit skewed in his perception. And you can understand that, and you can appreciate it, and you can empathize with that, because you've been reading this story that for the whole time this has been happening, time and place and memory have all seeped into one, and you can't quite separate them yourself. You understand how the character feels kind of almost drowned by this towards the end. The way that it is written is just absolutely stunning. It's very poetic in its writing. It's just a pleasure to read. I'll give you an example from the first page so that it doesn't give anything away. I lowered myself gently into the water, hardly daring to breathe, always with the fear that, as I entered the water world, the air, finally rid of my nuisance, would begin to rage and be transformed into furious wind, like the winter wind that nearly carried away houses, trees, and people. I don't know, like, it was just the imagery in it. It very much evokes the elements, and it always goes back to the elements, but the imagery is just so beautiful and so powerful and so strong, and it's intertwined throughout the whole text, which I just loved. And I loved the way that it sounded, and the way it kind of rolled around my mind and my tongue. It was it made me really slow down my reading and really enjoy it, and kind of appreciate all the words for what they were. Also, the way this book is structured is just so well crafted. Like I said, you don't feel tense, you don't feel that you don't know what's going to happen, and you feel like when twists do happen, you're greeted by an old friend. It's because things are set up so well in this book that they're brought up quite early on and left you to kind of mull over it, and then just at the perfect time when you're ready to learn about it, the author kind of introduces it again. Throughout the entire text, there are reflections of images and reflections of themes and topics and events that happen at different parts of the book, and they just bring back the memory of being at the start of the book or being in the middle of the book. And so you feel this sense of closure, of things growing and withering and being completed in their life cycle, which made it that much more pleasurable to know that things weren't going to be left unsaid or unwritten, which is very interesting because language plays quite an important role in this, especially given that it was written in Catalan, which Rodoreda had lived through Catalan as a language trying to be repressed and tried to be forgotten, and yet she holds on to it, and even the translator translates it in a way that keeps that thread of Catalan. There are words that are kept within the language, and of course they're words that we instantly recognise because they have their similarities to Spanish, but the fact that they're written differently to how they would be in Spanish provides that sense of empowerment with language, and that language isn't being forgotten, but at the same time the meaning of words can be forgotten and what that means when they are forgotten, which I found so fascinating. Now, I will say this, given the nature and the poetic feeling of this book, I think it can sort of have people feeling like they don't truly understand what's happening. And there were times when I didn't feel like I understood truly what was trying to be said by the author. And I think overall, there are parts that I definitely want to reread and to sort of analyse further, to kind of get a greater meaning from the symbols. However, saying that, I do feel like at the same time it is left in a way that kind of you can ascribe your own meaning to it, and I think the author's intention wasn't to have a very specific meaning, and I kind of feel a little bit annoyed that the book is marketing it as an allegory for living under the dictatorship, particularly being Catalan under Franco's dictatorship, which I can understand, but I feel like I personally didn't see it that way. It's set in a very small community, and it's not a community that is affected in any way by the outside world. It's all about the affects within this community and the sort of conformity within the small community itself. And whilst you can see links between fascism, I would also hazard to say that it's also just about social pressure and the pressure to assimilate to your closest group of people, with fear of being cast out of your society. So I think there is a lot of room for people to make their own opinions about it, and I have definitely made my own opinions and my own assumptions based on my experience. I was saying to Davide that I think he would have a very different reaction to this book, given that he is Italian, and he would have a very national memory of fascism, that whilst it didn't affect him personally or his family directly, that sort of collective national memory does have a big impact, and I can sense that somebody with that could read this book differently. And because I don't have that, the way that I've interpreted it is based around my own experiences and my own feeling or understandings of the world. So there's lots to unpack within this book, and I'm trying to not give as much away because this is just the surface level. There are so many different characters and so many different subcultures within this one community that gives it a real sense of having meaning so much more. None of the characters at any point ever are named, and I think that makes it so much more powerful and so much more easy for you to ascribe your own ideas upon it, or to engage different ideas from it. So I think this book is definitely one I want to reread soon. I want to let it simmer. I want to mull over it. I want to consider it even further, and I probably will make another video about it at a later date. However, right off the bat, I just wanted to say how much I did really enjoy reading this. It was such a pleasure, and I think lots of people will get lots from it. It's quite difficult when you don't want to give too much away about a book, and you don't want to sort of instill it with your own perceptions, because you want people to enjoy it for what they make of it. I also feel like the experience was enhanced by going into it not knowing that much about it, so I wanted to kind of give my review and my opinion on it without giving too much expectations of the style and the format and the plot that's going to take place. So if you do get around to it, I'm going to be really interested in hearing your thoughts. Other bit of advice before you go into it, I would skip reading the introduction by Colm Toibin. He just sounded like an absolute douche, and I think it put me off when I first read his introduction. It put me off a little bit, and I didn't feel as excited then going into the book as I was before I had read that. I don't understand why publishers get authors to write introductions like these sometimes. I often feel like sometimes they give too much away, or they try to tell you how to read it, and I don't think there is any right or way wrong of reading a book, especially this book. So listening to him telling me how to read it made me feel like he was just almost masturbating over his own intellect. He had a very clear idea that this book is a challenge to read, and that you have to read it in a certain way, you have to understand its context, and I don't agree with that at all. No book is a challenge to read. If it is, it means the writer has done a bad job. And reading Colm Toibin's idea of this book says a lot more about him than it does anybody else. So if you do happen to read his introduction, maybe to get a taste of what the book might be, just bear in mind that he probably likes the sound of his own words. One day, you'll realize the heart must live alone. Everything that envelopes it is worthless. Mine has lived. If only you knew how it has lived from spring to blazing leaves, and from blazing leaves to spring. When you're a man, you'll choke like me, and you'll remember my hand that was beginning to die, was thin, was no longer a hand. But he had to die like everyone else. They made him die in the center of the plaza. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another video. You can always give me a thumbs up if you liked it, and you can always subscribe if you haven't yet already. Bye bye.